Welcome to Course 4, Module 5, Chapter 15, Decarbonization and Strategic Supply Chain Design in the Circular Economy. In this presentation, we will examine how sustainable supply chains are being reshaped by carbon accounting, regulation, economic policy, and repair-oriented business models. The chapter begins with avoided virgin material purchases and explains why life cycle assessment is central for validating emission reductions. It then moves through global sustainability legislation, extended producer responsibility, carbon border mechanisms, carbon taxes, circular economy practices, right to repair requirements, and collaborations between original equipment manufacturers and independent repair networks. The central message is that firms can no longer treat sustainability as a separate compliance topic. Decarbonization is becoming a strategic design challenge for the entire supply chain, from materials and suppliers to product recovery, repair, and long-term resilience. First, we introduce the logic of avoided virgin material purchases and the role of life cycle assessment in measuring carbon savings. Second, we look at how global sustainability legislation changes supply chain design, governance, transparency, and reporting. Third, we examine extended producer responsibility laws, which make producers accountable for end-of-life management. Fourth, we discuss carbon border adjustment mechanisms and carbon taxes as economic instruments that price embedded emissions. Fifth, we explore circular economy practices as a strategic mitigation pathway. Sixth, we review right to repair compliance requirements, including product design and repair infrastructure. Seventh, we analyze collaborations between original equipment manufacturers and independent repair networks. Finally, we conclude by connecting these themes into a broader strategy for circular resilience and proactive decarbonization. This section introduces avoided virgin material purchases and explains why life cycle assessment is essential for credible carbon savings. The focus is on technical substitutability, recycling benefits, methodological risks, and the policies needed to support circular supply chains. This slide explains why avoided virgin materials are so important for decarbonization. When a company uses recycled material instead of newly extracted material, it can avoid emissions that would otherwise occur during mining, harvesting, refining, and primary processing. But the chapter stresses that this claim must be tested through life cycle assessment, or LCA. LCA looks across the full product life cycle rather than focusing only on one factory or one transaction. A crucial concept is technical substitutability. A recycled input only creates a credible avoided emission claim if it can perform the same function as the virgin input. If quality or functionality is compromised, the carbon saving may be overstated. Therefore, robust LCA methods help firms distinguish genuine circular decarbonization from unsupported environmental claims. The data on this slide illustrates the scale of possible carbon savings from recycling. The chapter cites research on Japan showing that maximizing post-consumer recycling could generate 12.8 million tons of direct carbon dioxide savings and 17.5 million tons of indirect savings. Direct savings come from the recycling activities themselves and the reduced need for primary material production. Indirect savings occur across connected sectors, because recovered materials can change demand and production patterns in wider supply chains. The point is not only that recycling matters, but that its benefits can spread beyond the immediate facility. The chapter also notes emerging approaches, such as using carbon dioxide as a carbon source for polymer products. These examples show why circular material flows deserve serious strategic attention. This slide focuses on the guardrails needed for credible avoided emission claims. The chapter warns that life cycle assessment can face methodological problems, including inconsistent modeling, double counting, and debates over terminology. These issues matter because firms, regulators, and investors may rely on LCA results to make strategic decisions. If the assumptions are weak, the claimed carbon savings can lose credibility. The chapter also reminds us that broader ecological effects must be considered, such as how changes in demand for virgin materials can affect land use or forest carbon stores. On the positive side, stronger business models, supportive recovery market policies, supplier environmental and social training, and stakeholder collaboration can improve the reliability of circular strategies. Credibility therefore depends on both technical rigor and governance. This section explains how global sustainability legislation changes supply chain design. It highlights SDGs, green supply chain management, supplier ESG training, transparency, Scope 3 reporting, and the tension between sustainability, efficiency, and resilience. This slide shows how regulation reshapes supply chain architecture. The first step is policy pressure. Governments and institutions introduce stricter environmental rules, due diligence obligations, and expectations for carbon reduction. The next step is network redesign. Firms may need to rethink sourcing locations, logistics routes, supplier relationships, and governance structures. Transparency then becomes essential, because companies must trace materials, emissions, and supplier practices across multiple tiers. Finally, these changes should support carbon reduction, not just administrative compliance. The chapter emphasizes that legislation can create both opportunities and operational burdens. To respond well, organizations need coordinated data systems, supplier engagement, and management processes that translate regulatory requirements into practical supply chain decisions. Compliance becomes an operating capability, not a one-time reporting exercise. Here we connect sustainability legislation to management practice. The chapter explains that sustainable development goals are increasingly being embedded into supply chain activities. This requires more than broad commitments. It requires specific strategies and disciplined execution. Green supply chain management is presented as a core approach for reducing climate impacts and industrial emissions. Supplier environmental, social, and governance training is also important because many emissions and sustainability risks sit outside the focal firm. If suppliers lack capability, transparency, or incentives, the overall chain cannot decarbonize effectively. The practical message is that companies must build sustainability into procurement, supplier development, performance measurement, and governance. In this view, sustainability is not an add-on. It becomes a routine operating principle across the supply network. This slide highlights one of the chapter's key tensions. Sustainable supply chains must also remain efficient and resilient. Regulations such as eco-design rules and due diligence directives can support environmental progress, but they may also introduce complexity, costs, and coordination challenges. In multi-crisis environments, firms must manage trade-offs between reducing emissions, maintaining low costs, and protecting continuity of supply. The chapter points to technological and framework-based responses, especially circular supply chain management. Circular approaches support zero waste, material traceability, and sustainable supplier selection. Blockchain is mentioned as a tool for tracking materials, while Scope 3 reporting remains a critical but fragmented area. The takeaway is that firms need integrated decision-making. Sustainability cannot be optimized in isolation from resilience, efficiency, and data capability. This section introduces extended producer responsibility. It shows how producers become accountable for end-of-life management, why EPR can create cost savings, and why regional governance models strongly affect operational complexity and design incentives. This slide summarizes the basic logic of extended producer responsibility. Instead of ending responsibility when a product is sold, EPR extends producer accountability into the use and end-of-life stages. The loop begins with design, because products can be made easier to collect, disassemble, recycle, or recover. It continues through sales, use, take-back, and recycling. The intention is to create a closed-loop system in which producers have incentive to reduce end-of-life costs through better design. The chapter emphasizes that this can support eco-design and reduce environmental impact, but it also requires financing, operational coordination, and clear governance. For supply chain managers, the implication is that product recovery is not a downstream afterthought. It becomes part of strategic network design and lifecycle responsibility. This slide examines the economics of EPR. The chapter explains that EPR does not automatically mean higher costs. Managed strategically, it can reveal savings and improve recovery performance. One example from the chapter is Sony Computer Entertainment Europe, which avoided a net cost of €408,000 by reviewing producer responsibility organization services. The chapter also notes that sharing responsibility for product recovery and decentralized supply chains can improve total supply chain profit and social welfare. However, there is an important warning. Collective EPR systems can pool costs across producers, which may weaken individual incentives for eco-design. If firms pay similar fees regardless of how repairable or recyclable their products are, design signals become diluted. Good EPR design must therefore preserve accountability and meaningful incentives. EPR systems vary significantly across regions, and this slide compares several models from the chapter. In the European Union, EPR is strongly integrated into environmental policy and emphasizes closed-loop end-of-life management and design for environment. However, implementation remains complex across member states. In North America, EPR is more decentralized, with states and provinces often taking the lead. This allows local tailoring but can create a fragmented patchwork for global producers. Japan uses a consumer-funded coupon system for appliance recycling, while China relies more heavily on government-led enforcement. Switzerland and Germany use specific financing mechanisms such as consumer recovery fees or national agency funds. The main lesson is that global firms cannot apply one uniform EPR model everywhere. Compliance requires regional adaptation. This section examines carbon border adjustment mechanisms and carbon taxes. It explains carbon leakage, embedded emissions, competitiveness impacts, trade equity concerns, and why policy design must balance decarbonization goals with sustainable development. This slide explains the basic mechanism behind CBAM and carbon taxes. The starting point is embedded carbon. Products carry emissions from the materials, energy, and production processes used to make them. A carbon border adjustment mechanism attempts to measure or estimate that carbon content and apply a cost at the border. Domestic carbon taxes apply a cost inside the jurisdiction. In theory, these policies level the playing field for producers facing stricter local environmental rules. They also encourage cleaner technology and, in some cases, more localized production. The chapter notes that CBAM can be especially relevant in energy-intensive sectors such as cement and steel. For supply chain leaders, the key message is that carbon intensity increasingly affects sourcing costs, trade decisions, and competitiveness. This slide focuses on carbon leakage. Carbon leakage occurs when firms relocate production to regions with weaker carbon regulations in order to avoid compliance costs. A domestic carbon tax by itself can sometimes create this risk, because local production becomes more expensive while imported alternatives remain cheaper. The chapter explains that CBAM can reduce this problem by applying a carbon cost to imports as well. When a domestic carbon tax is combined with a carbon border adjustment, the policy mix can encourage cleaner technology investment and reduce aggregate emissions across regions. However, the chapter also cautions that policy design matters. A border mechanism is not automatically a pure climate solution. It can also operate as a protective economic policy if equity and development concerns are neglected. This slide summarizes the tensions created by carbon pricing. CBAM and carbon taxes can support decarbonization, but they also reshape trade relationships and competitiveness. The chapter notes that without justice-oriented revenue recycling, CBAMs can worsen trade-related carbon inequities and increase carbon inequality between countries. For major exporters, such as China, carbon border policies may reduce export prices and slightly affect GDP and sector carbon intensity, while the global emissions effect may remain limited. The chapter also discusses distributional effects inside countries, including evidence that recycled carbon pricing revenues can benefit low-income groups. For emerging economies, especially the basic countries, active internal emission reduction is presented as more effective than passively absorbing tariffs. Carbon pricing therefore requires climate ambition and fairness. This section presents circular economy practices as a strategic shield against carbon pricing and volatility. It connects product redesign, resource recovery, waste reduction, green logistics, resilience, competitiveness, and the practical barriers firms face during implementation. This slide explains the shield metaphor. Circular economy practices can protect firms from rising carbon costs and market volatility by changing the material logic of production. Product redesign can make goods more modular, durable, and adaptable. Resource recovery can replace some virgin inputs with secondary materials. Waste reduction lowers unnecessary material and energy use. Green logistics can reduce transport-related emissions. Together, these practices reduce exposure to carbon pricing and strengthen the business case for circular supply chains. The chapter also connects circular economy integration with long-term emission reduction in G2.0 economies, especially when paired with advanced waste management and green logistics. The main point is that circularity is not only about closing loops. It is about building a lower carbon operating system. Circular strategies strengthen both decarbonization and resilience. The chapter states that practices such as product redesign and resource recovery have been shown to reduce Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. It also notes that Scope 3 impacts remain less clear, which means firms need better data and stronger supplier engagement. Beyond emissions, circular design can improve competitiveness by encouraging modularity, adaptability, innovation, and risk management. Resilience improves because firms become less dependent on virgin material flows that may be exposed to price shocks, scarcity, or geopolitical disruption. Renewable energy investments can further reduce corporate carbon intensity. The wider lesson is that circular economy strategy connects environmental performance with business continuity. It helps companies decouple growth from raw material consumption. Materially, this slide shows that circular economy implementation varies by sector and remains demanding. In manufacturing, circular practices can support a shift toward more sustainable operations and reduce exposure to carbon taxes. In aviation, circular pathways include sustainable aviation fuels and infrastructure electrification. Modern supply chains can also benefit from low-carbon investment strategies, while artificial intelligence may help accelerate industrial decarbonization when combined with circular economy practices. However, the chapter is clear that these opportunities come with barriers. Initial capital costs can be high. Organizational culture may need to change. Consumer behavior is not always aligned with circular models. Regional and industry differences also matter. Therefore, successful circular transformation requires tailored approaches, supportive policy frameworks, and disciplined implementation rather than generic sustainability statements. This section introduces right to repair compliance. It explains how repairability affects product design, spare parts, repair manuals, service infrastructure, consumer incentives, and policy alignment with broader circular economy and extended producer responsibility goals. This slide outlines the operating model behind right to repair. First, design for repair requires durable products, modular components, ease of disassembly, spare parts, and repair manuals. Second, information access matters because independent repairers and consumers need usable diagnostic knowledge. Third, service networks must be accessible, convenient, and cost-efficient. Fourth, consumer incentives shape whether people actually choose repair over replacement. Factors such as upfront cost, convenience, and retained product value are decisive. Finally, policy alignment is important because right to repair should connect with extended producer responsibility and value retention metrics. The chapter argues that these elements must be integrated. A repairable product without infrastructure is insufficient, and a repair network without product access cannot function effectively. compliance requires a full life cycle system. In practice, this slide compares product design requirements with repair infrastructure requirements. On the design side, firms need to plan for durability, modularity, disassembly, spare parts, repair manuals, and after-sales support. These decisions must happen early in the product lifecycle because repairability cannot be added easily after a product is already locked into a difficult design. On the infrastructure side, repair businesses need to provide services that are affordable, convenient, and well communicated. The chapter also notes that centralized maintenance workshops or pooled repair shops can consolidate resources, reduce repair time, and lower costs. The core message is that design enables repair, but infrastructure makes repair accessible. Right to repair therefore requires coordination between engineers, service providers, logistics managers, policymakers, and customers. Over time, this slide focuses on consumer willingness and policy fit. The chapter emphasizes that right to repair succeeds only if consumers actually choose repair. Their decisions are shaped by cost, convenience, the perceived value of the repaired product, spare parts access, and the availability of repair manuals. Economic instruments can support this choice. Reduced value-added tax on repair services or deposit refund schemes can make repair more attractive and help firms align profit models with repair legislation. The chapter also stresses that R2R policies must interlock with extended producer responsibility, especially through access to repair information and value retention metrics. Challenges remain, including consumer education, stakeholder conflict, warranty timing, and after-sales service duration. Managed conflict can even support mutual learning in repair ecosystems successfully. This section examines strategic collaboration between OEMs and independent repair networks. It highlights right to repair pressures, EAT platforms, authorized remanufacturing, quality control, brand protection, and the balance between cooperation and aftermarket control. This slide shows why OEMs and independent repair networks increasingly need each other. OEMs bring product knowledge, quality standards, brand reputation, and sometimes diagnostic platforms. Independent repair networks bring local reach, service capacity, and direct consumer access. Consumers benefit when repairs become more available, affordable, and trustworthy. The chapter presents this as a shift from closed control toward managed collaboration. OEMs can still protect quality and reputation, but they may need to open parts of the repair ecosystem to meet right to repair expectations. This collaboration directly addresses consumer barriers such as repair cost, spare parts availability, and local infrastructure. The managerial challenge is to balance control with openness. Too much control can restrict repair access, while too little can weaken quality assurance. This slide presents two collaboration pathways discussed in the chapter. The first is the use of industrial Internet of Things platforms for maintenance and after-sales services. When OEMs open these platforms to independent maintenance, repair, and operations firms, a competitive environment can emerge. Independent firms gain diagnostic technology, while OEMs can recover platform investments through royalties. The second pathway is authorization of third-party remanufacturers. Through authorization, OEMs can control quality and protect brand reputation while creating licensing revenues and expanding market reach. The chapter notes that these strategies can improve profits under the right conditions, but they also require careful governance. The overall message is that collaboration does not eliminate competition. It organizes competition around shared repair, remanufacturing, and life cycle goals. Effectively, this chapter shows that decarbonization is no longer only an environmental objective. It is becoming a core supply chain design requirement. Circular economy practices help companies reduce reliance on virgin materials, lower carbon exposure, and improve resilience. At the same time, regulations such as EPR, CBAM, carbon taxes, and right to repair are pushing firms to redesign products, strengthen traceability, and collaborate across ecosystems. The key takeaway is that compliance should not be treated as a cost alone. When managed strategically, it can drive innovation, improve competitiveness, and create more sustainable and resilient supply chains. This was our last chapter in Course 4. Thank you very much for your attention throughout this course.